This is Big Podcast.
Hey, quick heads up. I'm working on a new training for podcasters. This is specifically about how to get a great interview. I've done hundreds of these over the years. People ask me all the time, how do I become a better interviewer? How do I get great guests? Those are the kind of things that we're going to talk about. I can use your help putting it together. I want to make sure that it's good from A to Z, the before the interview, the during the interview, and the after interview follow-up. I want to make sure everything is covered. If you participate, I'm going to give you this training for free. To make sure that you get that episode with more information, this is what you need to do. Go right now to bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That's bigpodcast.com/subscribe and subscribe. It will be the next thing that I release. Make sure you don't miss it. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. The podcast, by the way, this podcast, Build a Big Podcast, the marketing podcast for podcasters. If you want to grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make people care about your podcast, make more money with your podcast, make a podcast that people would miss if you were to disappear. This is the podcast for you. Bigpodcast.com, that's the website. My name is David Hooper. That's where you'll find me talking about this kind of stuff all the time. Growing your podcast audience, getting people to your podcast, making a podcast that people care about. This is the audio edition of my weekly newsletter. That is called Big Podcast Insider. This is issue number 220. This is what we're talking about. Small audiences, cheap equipment. Did I just get lucky? What makes a good host? 35 lessons for podcasters. Relationship advice, part 2. As I mentioned, everything on this podcast, it's about growing your podcast, getting people to your podcast, making money with your podcast. This episode of Build a Big Podcast brought to you by Riverside.fm, a virtual studio that makes recording and editing at the highest quality possible, accessible to anyone. You're going to look and sound your best. You're doing a video podcast? Riverside's got you. They're going to record you and your guests locally, audio, and if you want, video as well, bypassing poor and unstable internet connections and giving you studio quality audio, if you want it, video. You're going to get studio quality recordings, lightning fast editing, and you're going to get some cool AI tools to help you market your podcast. One of the ones that I love, they call it Magic Clips. It's going to take your long form podcast, go through it, analyze it, find what works for short form clips for social media, for promos, chop them up, give them back to you in those little bite-sized chunks that work so great on social media and short-form video sites. You're going to love this thing. It helps you record. It helps you edit. It helps you market. There's a free account waiting for you at Riverside.fm. They're going to give you a couple of hours to use all these features, look under the hood, kick the tires, interview a guest, interview 2 guests. See how you like it. If you want to stick around, I've got a discount code for you. It's Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. The URL, Riverside.fm to get 15% off. Here's the discount code. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. All right, let's get to it. I'm going from thing to thing to thing, all of them about podcasting, specifically growing your podcast. And that could be how to have a better podcast, how to market your podcast better, how to make a podcast that people care about. When I go from one thing to the next thing, there's a demarcation point, and it sounds like this. That's how you know. If you want more information, go to newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That's where I've got it. All the links, more details on what I'm talking about. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 220. Small audiences, cheap equipment. One of my goals for this year, it has been to release more storytelling episodes of this podcast, Build a Big Podcast. I've already done 3. If you have not heard them, go back into the archives, or when you go to bigpodcast.com and subscribe, and wait to receive that information about the podcast interviewing training that I'm developing. You will also find these episodes. 1, the 8-second podcast challenge, Prince's janky recording studio. Talking about the musician, not the podcaster Prince. Is there a podcaster Prince? Regardless, it's about the musician, and it's a great story about janky recording equipment and what you can do with it to make it sound like $1 million. Also, the magic of small audiences. Small audiences are a gift. If you haven't listened to these episodes, get them now, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. As a bonus, I'm going to let you know more about the training that I'm doing about how to become a better podcast host. No purchase necessary. I mean, for some people, but if you want to work with me, you want to make it better, and that's letting me know what you need out of this training, I will give it to you for free. Everything you need coming up at bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Hey, real quick, I want to talk about Big Podcast AMP. If you like this podcast, if you like my newsletter, you are going to love Big Podcast AMP. AMP stands for Audio Monetization Program. It's a personal coaching program that's going to help you do 3 things. 1, grow your podcast audience. 2, get people talking about your podcast. And 3, make more money with your podcast and your podcasting skills. I was having a discussion with my buddy Shrikant Joshi out of Pune, India today. You know, one of the things that podcasters are being hired for right now, like crazy, AI development. These .com companies, AI developers, they've got a ton of money and they need people with our skills, people who can communicate a message with their voice, people who know how to use words, the spaces between the words, emotion. If you are one of those people, yeah, you are, because you're here. That's a great opportunity for you. And I got a lot of opportunities for you. Also, some things that you can do to grow your own podcast. If you're interested, this is where to get details. bigpodcast.com/amp. That's bigpodcast.com/AMP. Did I just get lucky? Do you ever ask yourself that? That's a common question for podcasters, also authors, others that I work with. The answer, yes. Sometimes you were lucky. We need to be honest with ourselves about this. For example, being in the right place at the right time. I know a guy who just happened to be in the room, actually the hall on the outside of the studio, when a well-known commercial for Budweiser was being recorded. Remember the frogs? Bud, Y, Zer. This dude's walking down the hall. They got a couple guys, Bud and Wise. They needed the Zer. I said, hey, man, can you hop in the studio, get behind the mic and say Zer? He's like, oh, I guess so. That commercial hit the Super Bowl. It went crazy. It became part of our pop lexicon. And this dude, every time the commercial plays, he is making money. Not bad for about 3 seconds of work. That's what I talk about when I talk about podcasting opportunities, by the way. They are everywhere. And sometimes they come up from you being in the right place at the right time. You can't really set yourself up to win on that. You never know when the right place at the right time is going to come up. But when it does come up, you want to be ready for the opportunity. And that's the second part of this. There are plenty of times when it was your skill set that enabled you to be successful. So did you just get lucky? Yeah, maybe. Right place, right time. But it's the skill set that really delivers. If you have ever doubted yourself, you've gotten in your head about your podcast and its success, I've got something I want you to watch. Let me give you a couple notes on it. This guy talks about overcoming fear of failure. Fear of abilities and potential failure, that can be paralyzing. It's okay to admit that. I know they're the failure porn guys on Instagram. I've got imposter syndrome, and they really wallow in that. Most of us, though, we never talk about it. We never talk about what it's like to go to an audition. We never talk about how scary it can be to release an episode. We never talk about what it's like to try to go for a sponsorship deal and negotiate that. Anyway, this guy's talking about that and how to overcome it. Keep this in mind. Past failures, they do not define future performance. You can always change your path. And that's one of the reasons as podcasters, we get in and we try things. Sometimes they work. Sometimes they work big. But other times, the opposite side of that, they blow up. I was taking an improv class one time. This is the guy who taught Stephen Colbert improv, or one of the guys. Went to a workshop with this dude, and he was talking about working with Colbert, and one of the big things they worked on was what he called embracing the bomb. You can imagine being in an improv crew. And it's a lot like podcasting. When something works with improv, boom, it blows up. It's huge, big laughs. And when it doesn't, which is probably more often than not, maybe it doesn't get any laughs. And maybe it really bombs. It's like, boo, people get up and walk out. You can't be afraid of that. In order to get to the good stuff, you got to at least try. And sometimes the bad stuff is going to come along. Here's what he advises. Embrace the process of starting, even if you're scared. He says to look at your growth over time, recognize that growth, and then appreciate it. This is one of the reasons that it's important for you to go back on your old podcast episodes, compare them to where you are now. You don't see yourself getting better. You don't hear yourself getting better. It is a long, slow process. But if you went back, 3 months, 6 months, a year, definitely. And certainly if you've been doing this longer than a year, 2, 3, 5 years, you're going to hear a big difference. I do this with everything that I do. Books, websites. You ever gone back to something you've done 5, 6 years ago? Maybe if you're like me, you've been doing it a lot longer than that, and go back to something way, way back in your career. You think, what was I thinking? I had a book, and it was about independent CD releases, independent album releases. And we're talking about parties. We used to call them CD release parties. Really, more specifically, it was about album release parties. CD, cassette, digital downloads, whatever. The package of songs that we call an album. And on this cover, it's almost embarrassing to admit, but just to show that everybody's got mistakes. Independent, E-N-T at the end. It was spelled independent, A-N-T. And I don't know if it was a typo by me or the graphic designer tried to retype something and it didn't work out well, A-N-T instead of E-N-T. But regardless, it says independent music releases. But here's the bottom line. I sold a ton of those things. They helped a lot of people. It made people a lot of money. It helped people have a lot of success. If I'd worried about every little thing, none of that would have happened. So think about that with your podcast. I've got a whole list of this stuff at newsletter.bigpodcast.com about shaking off self-doubt, self-compassion and generosity, embracing your journey as a podcaster, taking action and enjoying your podcasting work. Because let's face it, it can be a grind. All this in service of the question, did I just get lucky? Yeah, kinda. I mean, yeah, you were lucky, but not just get lucky. You also had some skills. I want you to take a look at it. It's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 220. I've got the highlights written. You want to watch the full video? Watch it. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 220. What makes a good host? Okay, one more plug for this. I am going to help you become a better host, specifically by doing better interviews. If you're interested in finding out about that, I'm going to give you this free training. You need to help me with it because I want to make sure that I'm covering everything. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Subscribe to the podcast. I will send you the information via the podcast feed. It's the next episode that I'm putting out. You will get it. Let me know what you want to learn more about. I'm going to send you this training for free. Everybody else who doesn't do this, you can pay for it. But let's talk about what makes a good host. If you go to newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 220, I've got a funny joke with Skeletor. Remember Skeletor? If you're Gen X like me, you're going to remember Skeletor. In fact, I've actually got a Skeletor hanging in my studio. It's a reminder of this. Life experience is what makes you a good host. Life experience brings empathy and it brings understanding. You've probably heard me talk about Zita Christian before. She is the oldest podcaster I know to start a podcast. She was 69 years old when she started. She edits her own stuff, records her own stuff, books her own stuff. She's still going strong well into her 70s. She's got a podcast called My Spouse Has Dementia. And when she is interviewing a caregiving spouse, because her spouse had dementia, she can go deeper than somebody like I could. I don't know that world. I know it in a way that, yeah, I'm a good host, and yeah, I'm a good interviewer. I can ask questions about it. But for somebody to really sit down next to somebody who's been through a traumatic event and be able to connect in a personal way and really connect to the people who are listening in a personal way, that takes life experience. Pedro Pena, you've heard me talk about him. He's a person who stutters. I know, right? A guy who stutters hosting a podcast. That's how I started talking to this dude. He sent me a letter. Hey, man, I love your book. I got a book. Have I talked about it? Big podcast. You can find it on Amazon. Anyway, Pedro sends me something. I love your book. And it says, My Stuttering Life. I said, wait a minute. That's the last guy you would think that would have a podcast. But he does. Think about how powerful that is. For somebody who stutters, maybe they're embarrassed to speak, nervous about speaking, they're shy. To hear somebody like them, somebody who represents them with the same or a similar condition, to host a podcast. That is bold, man. That's what makes you a great host. It's not being a golden voiced baritone. Like, hey, everybody. Old school stuff that we used to hear on the radio. No. It's being real. It's having experiences. That's what's going to connect you with your guests. That's what's going to connect you with the people who are listening to you. So what makes a good host? Digging into your experience. If you want to see this joke, and it's not really a joke, but the picture of Skeletor, newsletter.bigpodcast.com, issue number 220. 35 lessons for podcasters. Some great lessons. These are actually stolen from newsletter writers. They also apply to podcasting. I'm not going to read all 35 of them, but I do want to go over some of them. There's no competition for your personal voice. That's number one. And that is what I was just talking about. Zita Christian. She's a caregiving spouse of somebody with dementia. That is very personal. That is very unique. Unless you've been in that situation, you're not going to come in and do anything close to her as far as connection with guests who have been in that situation or your audience who's been in that situation. Pedro Pena, person who stutters. Unless you're a stuttering person yourself, you're not going to connect with listeners who stutter like he is. Number 2, build relationships. All you need is one relationship to change or save your project, career, or life. One. That is it. Makes it seem doable, right? I was talking to a guy, a strip club DJ. Did you perk up? Okay. This is a great story. He's working with an entertainer, a dancer. She's beautiful. The other girls are jealous. They thought she had it easy. He said she walked up to him and she said, all these girls think I got it so easy, but let me tell you what I do. I'm not good at sales, which in this case, selling private dances. She told him, I just walk up to people and I said, would you like a dance? And 9 out of 10 times they say no. 1 out of 10 times they say yes. And I know if I do that all night, I'm going to walk out of here with $1,000. That was her thing. Just looking for that one person. Now, for her, 1 out of 10, maybe your ratio is a little bit different. 1 out of 5, maybe it's a little bit better. But really, you just need one person to change or save your project, career, or life. Sometimes you need that one person more frequently, but think of it like that. Get that yes. Be human. That's number 3. People recognize spam. People recognize a sales pitch. People also recognize honest, direct communication. And that is where podcasts excel. Be real, be vulnerable. How much more vulnerable could you be than somebody like Zita Christian that's talking about her marriage, caring for her spouse with dementia? How much more vulnerable could you be than somebody like Pedro Pena, a person who stutters, talking about things like asking a woman on a date? And it doesn't have to be crazy, like the failure porn and the things that I'm talking about. It can be honest. As a matter of fact, Pedro told me a funny story. He said, I went into the bank. I needed to deposit a check or cash a check, do some kind of transaction. I was nervous. I didn't want to speak. I wrote it down, slipped the teller a note. They thought I was robbing the place. So that vulnerability, that can also be funny. It can also be interesting. It doesn't have to be heartbreak. It doesn't have to be embarrassing. It doesn't have to be your biggest failure. Number 4, the biggest metric is listener interaction. People talk about downloads, or I got so many likes, which likes arguably, that's interaction, but not much of it. Downloads, not everybody's listening to it. To count on YouTube, 3 seconds? A very little sliver of time to count as a view. What you want is interaction. People are going to talk to you. People are going to have conversations. People are going to tell their friends about you. That's why I want to talk about Big Podcast Amp. That's the goal, to get people talking about you to other people. You can talk about your podcast all you want. It would be better for you to have 10 people talking about your podcast to their friends, and those friends talk about your podcast to their friends. You can only talk about your podcast so much. You're not going to reach that many people. Number 5, perfection sucks and it's boring. And look, don't think that I'm saying you can't edit your podcast. Edit it, man. Make it tight. But it doesn't have to be perfect. God knows. Sometimes there are things that I've said on here and other things that I have done where I'm thinking, push the boundary a little too much. And speaking of interaction, I hear about it. Man, I was doing a live event. This is a podcasting event. And I think it was the guy that I was co-organizing it with. He took feedback. I was the main MC for the event. And he said, get David Hooper off the stage. He has no business being on stage. Didn't like some of the jokes that I told. Like I'm talking about. Embrace the bomb. Get out there. Take chances. That guy might not have liked what I said. Other people did. Regardless, what I said, it still impacted him enough to have that interaction with me. And also, it clarified, hey, dude, maybe David Hooper, not for you. Now, on the opposite of that, number 6, no one cares. Not initially. You've got to give them reasons to care. Earn 5 seconds of their attention. Then earn the next 5. It's like that next right person. Find that one person to say yes. Do what you need to do. Then find the next one person to say yes. All we are doing when we get on the podcast mic and deliver an episode is keeping people engaged. Give me a minute. Give me 2 minutes. Give me 3 minutes. Take whatever you're doing in that first minute, then expand upon it. 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes, an hour. Expand it as long as you can. Keep people engaged. And then on the next episode, do it again. And the next episode, and the next episode, and the next episode. Number 7, new idea, just start. You can't establish relationships if you're not out there. Whatever it takes, get your idea out there now. Course correct. If you find something's not working, it's never too late to change your path. Every failure is possible entertainment for your audience. Your audience wants you to win. And when we talk about connecting with an audience in a human way, it's important for an audience to see you fail. Take it back to Stephen Colbert. Embrace the bomb. It might not feel good as that big applause, but it might actually be more helpful to your audience and help propel you to the next thing that does work for you. Number 8, be consistent. People are creatures of habit. That's why consistency works. Become part of their routine. If you do one thing with your podcast, keep showing up. Well, there are a lot of things, but this is one of the foundationals. Keep showing up. Should you release the same day and time each week? Yeah, maybe. You just need people to listen and listen consistently. I talked about my book, Big Podcast. Search for it on Amazon if you're interested, or bigpodcast.com/book. There's a direct link there. One of the most controversial things in that book, and this is sort of embracing the bomb because people didn't get this. I told people to start with 25 episodes. Do not launch your podcast and really get behind it till you've got 25 episodes out. And some people are like, by God, I'm only doing 2 episodes a month. That's going to take me a year. Well, technically, a year and 2 weeks, because a year's only 24 episodes. But my point is this, is that you've got one time, one chance to reach a new person, make a first impression, and become part of their routine. If you've got 25 episodes up, and let's say it's about podcasting, and I've got one about compressors, and then one about limiters, and one about timers, and one about cloud lifters, and one about interfaces, and one about software, and one about hardware. If you see all those things there, you're into podcasting, and I can get you to listen to 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even all 25 of those episodes, I have become part of your routine. You're going to listen to 26, 27, 28, whatever I settle down to every week, every 2 weeks. You're going to keep going. That is why you want to launch with 25 episodes. Now, can you do it with 5 or 10? Yeah, you can. Bottom line is this, you want to become part of their routine. So give them something to start up a routine with. People are skeptical. If you tell somebody, hey, I'm starting a podcast, and you've got 1 episode, how many times have we heard that? They're like, yeah, okay, come back to me. When we were doing syndication on my music business show, the broadcast show, the deal was they wanted to make sure that we had 100 episodes in the can because they didn't want us to go and get a contract with the station and say, oh, sorry, we stopped doing the show, or we don't have an episode this week, where those stations are using their time and their resources, their sales guys to go out there and sell the thing for us. Or really for them, it's a split. 50-50 is how that works if you're curious. 50% for the station, 50%, that's a national sponsor that you've already sold. They wanted you to have 100 episodes in the can that you could run. That way they knew you were going to stick around. There's a similar thing to this here where I am in Nashville. Musicians who come to town, they talk about Nashville being a 7-year town, 10-year town, whatever, different variations of it. It's the same kind of thing. I had a guy in my neighborhood. I don't know how I met this guy. I guess I knew his landlord, and he was from Dayton, country music guy. Big in Dayton, but this is the big leagues in Nashville. So comes to Nashville, and I mean this in the nicest way. He got schooled, got his handed to him. It's one thing to do country music in Dayton. It is one thing to do country music in Chunky, Mississippi. It is one thing to do country music in Walla Walla, Washington. But Nashville, that's the big leagues. Same for modeling. Enterprise, Alabama, you're a pretty girl. Yeah, great. You're the homecoming queen. Go to New York, Miami, yeah. Competition is a little bit different. You got to stick things out. You will learn the skills that it takes and be able to work at a higher level if you stick it out. But people aren't going to take your word for it that it's coming. They want to see that you've done it. And that means for podcasters, episodes in the can. That means for somebody in a city like Nashville for country music singer, New York for modeling. That means that you've been hanging out for a little bit. You put in the time. They can see that you're serious. Number 9, deliver value. Solve someone else's problem. The bigger, the better. Does your podcast solve a problem? You might think, no, it's just an entertainment podcast. Okay, that solves a problem. My commute to work is boring. Entertain me, man. Are you solving a problem? If you're doing that, you'll be all right. Number 10, only one person is listening to your podcast at a time. You are not a broadcaster. Me on the way to work, that's not a broadcast. That is you talking to me. Me at the gym, not a broadcast. That is you talking to me. That's how all your listeners are. Wherever they are, you're talking to one person. So consider that. That is 10 out of the 35, all 35, and they're great lessons. I have them linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is issue number 220. Relationship advice, part 2. It's Valentine's Day month. It'll be nice to get into some relationship advice, not just marketing for podcasters. I'm kidding. I've got a joke related to podcasting and relationships because we do have relationships with our listeners. Let me tell you a story. When I was in college, I had a female friend. She came to me. She was really angry. Her boyfriend, he had not spent as much on her Valentine's Day gift as she'd spent on his. And I don't know what it was. It's kind of funny looking back on it now. I'm sure it was like, $10 versus $50 or something. She's like, oh, and I brought him all this and he just didn't do. She was very upset. And I remember thinking, man, that feels really transactional. Maybe this dude didn't have a lot of money. He put a lot of time in. I saw it from his side. But I also understood the emotion behind it. The issue wasn't really about money. She wanted to see that this guy was showing up. It goes back to what I was just talking about, the 10-year town. Seeing those episodes in the feed that a listener can listen to. They know that you're showing up when you've got multiple episodes they can listen to. They know you're showing up when you've been in town for 7 or 10 years, playing, writing, doing whatever it is that you say you want to do. Not just talking about what you're doing, but doing it. And it's the same thing here. Same is true for podcasters and downloads. It feels really transactional when people talk about that. But do you really want more downloads or are you looking for something else? Something you think more downloads will provide? What would more downloads get you? Better sponsors? You can have sponsors with just a few people. The biggest podcasts that I know don't have a lot of listeners. I've talked about doing a very local podcast, hyper-local, one neighborhood. Per listener, the most successful podcast that I have ever had. There are some medical-related podcasts that talk about a very specific, let's call it condition, a disease that not a lot of people have, but pharmaceutical companies need to get the word out about a cure or a treatment. Maybe there's some kind of rehab that's available for these people. They are going to pay to reach that specific audience. The show that I talked about, Music Business Radio, syndicated show just for musicians, a very specific audience. You don't need a lot of people listening to your stuff to get sponsors, to get money, to get syndication. You just need a specific audience. It's not only about the numbers. Yeah, numbers help, but it's who's listening. Let's get real for a minute. There's a lot of traffic on Twitter. There's a lot of traffic on Pornhub. It is not quality traffic. Ad rates for either of those sites, not much. Can they get you 80 bajillion views? Yes. But those people aren't there to buy. They're there to rant or to do whatever people do on Pornhub. Use your imagination. I'm going to wrap it up with one more piece of relationship advice. Thank you for listening to this podcast. It means a lot to me. There are a lot of podcasts on podcasting, a lot of people talking about this. I appreciate you sticking out with me. If you want to work with me one-on-one, bigpodcast.com/amp. That has more information. I'd love to help you grow your podcast, get more people to your podcast, make a podcast that matters. I'd love for you to listen to this again. If you have not already subscribed, and again, you want to do it now, because in the next episode, I'm going to be sending out some information about this training that I've got you can get for free if you work on it with me. And by working on it with me, it means you telling me what you need me to cover in this training for you to have it be successful for you. The training about interviewing, if you want to be a better podcast interviewer or radio interviewer, or somebody who's interviewing your family, getting those stories on tape. I'm going to help you do it. This is how to make sure you don't miss that announcement and how to get in touch with me. It's bigpodcast.com/subscribe. When you go there, you're going to see 3 buttons, one for Android, one for iPhone, one is an RSS feed, 3 buttons. You pick one depending on how you get your podcast. One click is all it takes. You get subscribed, you get the information on this interviewing training, and you get as many episodes as you want of this podcast, Build a Big Podcast. Thank you again for listening. I do appreciate you, And if you go to bigpodcast.com/subscribe right now, I will see you on the next episode.